Excellent. Morning or afternoon, everybody, or evening, depending on where you're at. I will give everybody a moment here to get started, and then we'll get rolling with this month's HADR virtual chapter presentation. Okay, looks like folks are coming on in just fine. Okay. I think when the rest come on in, we'll get started here. I'll go ahead and kick off with a little bit of general housekeeping. This is past community news for October 2018. First of all, if you have not already made arrangements to make it to this year's PASS Summit, I implore you, it is the best SQL Server and data platform related conference of the year. You gotta go. We've got our discount code up here. Please make arrangements to go. It's really one of the best things you can do for networking, for education, for just getting to know the community. It's a phenomenal event. It's one I will never miss. They've also got some swag. So I might actually be buying that hoodie myself because I had one last year and it's really comfortable. But a lot of good stuff in there if you want to go ahead and fill your coffers with some cool goodies and toys. Activities this year are awesome. So if you can make it, the Buddy program is a really cool program. There's games night, birds of a feather luncheon, and the first timer orientation and speed networking, which is also just a blast. So again, make the time. If you're an introvert, go to these different things. You will not regret it. It's a really good setup. Also, we do need volunteers for the event. We need folks to help lead the Birds of a Feather luncheon discussions and also to deal with the PASS Summit Ambassador Program. So if you're interested, please contact PASS down below there. We'd love to have you on board. This is the 20th PASS Summit, which is wild. If you've had just wonderful events there, if you've had great experiences or stories that come from there, share them with PASS. They'll get this out in some of their periodic newsletters. It's really cool to go see just what an impact this conference has made on people's lives and careers. PASS Marathon Architect, good series of just high level webinars and things on October 3rd for the registration opening. It's going to happen on October 17th. So go there, get some more information, and go ahead and register. It should be open for registration now. The Board of Directors election is coming up here on October 10th. Accepting applications then. If you're interested, it's worthwhile. I urge you, go check it out. Also, we are looking for new sponsors. So if you know of anybody, in corporate America that's interested in sponsoring this, it is a really solid return. It's a good community. It's a great way to get the name out there. So if you know anybody, have them go ping PASS there. Upcoming virtual group webinars. We're not the only virtual chapter out there. Today, HADR, tomorrow, data architecture and global Italian, women in technology, cloud, a lot of really good sessions coming up. And if you haven't seen these before, or just check out this one, go look. There are a lot of virtual chapters out there, and there's guaranteed to be some in here for a session or a topic that really intrigues you. Go check it out. These are free, these are recorded, they're available, these are every month, they're wonderful. Also, if you haven't been to a SQL Saturday out there, there are SQL Saturdays all over the world. These are, again, just incredible events. These are some of my favorite pastimes. It's almost an addiction at this point. Go check them out. If anybody's interested, I'll be at the Lincoln one here at the end of this month. Join PASS. If you're on here, chances are you're already a member, but if you're not, join up. It's really good stuff. And finally, connect with PASS out at the hashtag SQLPass, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. Go check it out. It's worthwhile. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to David Pless. We're going to talk today about SQL Server always-on availability groups on how you deploy them on both the Windows and the Linux platform. So David, I'll turn this over to you.
All right. So can we see my screen?
Give me one moment here.
Oh, you can switch it over. Fantastic.
There we go.
All right, and speaking of SQL Saturday, October 13th is Columbus, Georgia, provided that everything's fine after Hurricane Michael, bearing down on the Panhandle.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'm in Titusville, Florida, so this one's gonna dodge us, it looks like. But yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
October 13th in Columbus. All right, so we're going to talk about always-on availability groups, Windows Linux deployments. I'm going to go over some features, some core concepts,
Go ahead and share your screen there.
Oh,
Sorry. You have to reshare it when I turn it back over to you. There we go.
Can you see it now?
I can.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Otherwise, I'd be talking and no screen. All right. Always on availability groups, Windows and Linux deployments. This is building blocks. And so in this session, and this could be one of many, I'm going to give kind of an overview. How do we get to an availability group solution, some health, some features, some functionality, what's net new 2016, 2017, maybe a little 2019 in there, and what you should be looking at when you're thinking about what I like to call a recovery strategy, an availability strategy, a disaster recovery strategy. All those three core concepts really should be looked at as separate scenarios, in my opinion. I'm a technical solution professional from Microsoft. Just a little bit about me. I was a PFE MCS consultant for quite a while. I was also a database administrator for Check Free Corporation out of Norcross, Georgia. And key things I cover: performance tuning, optimization, reporting services, Power BI, availability groups, disaster recovery, anything in Azure, Azure SQL Database, IaaS, Managed Instance, Operational Insights. Now it's called Azure Monitor. I should change that. Azure Monitor, Azure Advisor. And if you need me, I'm easy to get to. D+. There's not many pluses in the world. D+ on Twitter. So a lot of things that were added, a lot of capabilities were added in SQL Server 2016, 2017. Where we're kind of really honing our focus on is 2016, 2017 on a Linux platform. Some key things that we've added is 3 synchronous replicas for auto failover, round robin load balancing of replicas. This is really important for a reporting scenario. So if you're trying to scale out your reporting solutions and you don't want all of the report requests going to the first secondary and that's involved in a always on deployment, you're really going to want 2016 up, which got that round robin load balancing of replicas. Auto failover on database health. This is an interesting one. I would say that this one sometimes gets passed over. It's like, oh yeah, if you have a database failover, it'll fail over the availability group. Yeah, that's true, but it also affects how you look at an availability group failover. So if a database can cause the whole group to fail over, maybe that changes how I structure my groups in my box. I'm not just saying, well, how about 5 per group or 10 per group? Now it becomes more of a decision of, wait a second, how does this affect the rest? And maybe groups have purpose. So it does change the way you look at an availability group based on that scenario alone. We'll get more into that. DTC for transactional integrity across instances with always on. A lot of customers were doing this without the support. It is now supported. So this is something that you're going to get the scenarios for those DTC type of transactional scenarios. Support for SSIS on always on, and one of the ones that I would say that's really, really important here is the performance capabilities that were added in 2016, 2017. They've completely rebuilt the transport layer for always on availability groups. It's a lot more resilient, a lot more capable as terms of scaling out, especially for geo-replication situations. Okay, so really quick on high availability disaster recovery concepts. I always feel like I need to spend a little bit of time on this. Disaster recovery is taking action after a failure occurs to recover any lost data and make that data available again, with time being a critical factor. Where high availability is really kind of masking, obfuscating the complexity behind the scenes in order for the application to stay available. So if you kind of think of those two things as separate scenarios, high availability as far in terms of application availability, the appearance of that application being up and ready for end users, and disaster recovery being that scenario to recover in the worst case scenario, minimize data loss, recover as much as possible, think in terms of recovery. Those are the key differences between high availability and disaster recovery. Now, we often need to think about your recovery point objective and your recovery time objective. Now, we've made some changes from requirements. Back in the day, you had to have all the hardware the same. everything had to be exactly the same across your environment. You had to be part of this hardware compatibility list, had to be the exact same for a cluster-based solution. That's no longer the case. As long as you pass the checks, this is a supported configuration. What I'll tell you is really important is to monitor and to make sure that you are not losing any data and you're not having any risks in your environment. So the key scenarios it comes down to is your recovery point objective and your recovery time objective. Your recovery point objective can be measured from an availability perspective, looking at the SYN queue. This is how much data that you could potentially lose in an always-on scenario. And you have the recovery time objective is your redo queue. Now this is purely examining the transaction log. How much data has been sent, how much data has been applied. If over here is my primary, and my primary is like the Whopper from War Games, some monster machine, and my secondary is like, I don't know, a gateway desktop I found on eBay, something that is not going to come anywhere near catching up to my primary, I'm going to suffer. Okay, if I have latency on my secondaries, I'm going to have trouble applying my logs. My recovery time objective is going to suffer. If I have trouble getting the data out from my primary to my secondary, I could incur data loss. This is something that is really important to monitor. There's several ways to monitor it. Monitor it in perfmon. You can monitor it in the DMVs. And it's really easy to monitor through the dashboard in an always-on availability group. These are just kind of key principal things from a high availability and disaster recovery perspective. Now, we've had capabilities before 2012. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I want folks to be aware that we're not, from a consulting perspective, I'm not going to say everything is always on availability groups. I have customers that use Mixtopologies all the time, including log shipping. The only one I would steer you away from is database mirroring because it's deprecated. But failover clustering is a viable, strong option. It is designed to recover from server failures. It is very strong, and it can be used in mixed topologies with always-on availability groups. Always-on availability groups would not be what it is without database mirroring. Taking a database, streaming it from one machine to the next with a witness being the arbitrator of failover, the quorum of a failover scenario, this is where always-on availability groups came from. This is what started the technology that we know as always-on availability groups. Log shipping is not going anywhere. It is not deprecated. It's been around for quite a long time. One of the biggest scenarios is that I can have some sort of a time delay from my DR perspective. This is a very important situation if you are trying to recover from a potential DR situation where I maybe need to look back maybe an hour or two, and the delay is something that I want to have as part of my solution. Maybe I'm even using log shipping from my primary to an Azure deployment. This is something that certainly can be done. So these mixed topologies are perfectly fine. You can go online and look for those kind of scenarios, always on availability groups with failover clustering support, with log shipping support, both on-prem as well as Azure-based deployments. All right, so let's get into like the technology of always-on availability groups. Now, kind of a comparison a little bit. So we have our failover cluster instances and our always-on availability groups. Some enhancements that I want to mention. I really kind of focus on Windows a little bit. From a deployment perspective, I recommend at least SQL Server 2012 R2, preferably 2016. A lot of it has to come down to the quorum. I don't have a whole slide on the quorum. We can talk about that at a later time if we want to take a deep dive on that situation. But you want to use some sort of node majority kind of decision making in the quorum, where essentially the number of nodes with a tiebreaker, which is some sort of witness, could be a file share witness, cloud witness, is important. Back in the day, everyone used the Q drive. And the problem with the Q drive is it's a single point of failure. And without the quorum, we cannot initiate a failover response. So this has gotten to be really resilient. I would say SQL or Windows Server 2012 R2 and up, with a strong preference of Windows Server 2016 and up. And we can get into the details on that. But the cloud witness allows you to have a cloud-based failover option, which is certainly strong for geographic deployments. Any questions up at this point?
Not so far.
Okay.
We'll keep rolling here. If anybody
All
has
right.
any questions, definitely put it in the chat window here, and we'll be happy to answer them.
Okay. Yep. Site awareness gives you the scenario where you can prefer the local site when deciding like which node to bring online. Where fault domains takes us a little bit further, where you can define like the node, chassis, rack location addition to the site. Definitely important for geographic deployments, definitely important from a failover cluster perspective, always on availability group perspective. And these are all Windows-based solutions. From a comparison, just head-to-head comparison of a Windows or let's say a failover cluster instance to an always on availability group scenario. If I'm failing over a machine, right, I'm shutting down SQL Server. So I've got to roll forward and roll back transactions. That could take any amount of time. What is it going to depend on? How fast are my disks? How much load am I taking? How much do I have to roll back or apply? I'm going to have to move that storage over from server A to, let's say, server B, start SQL Server up, go through all the database consistency checks and health checks that is part of a startup routine, and then I'm going to have my virtual network name, and all those components are going to be necessary in order for a machine to connect to that machine, to that server B. That could take minutes. Depending on if you have a high VLF count or other scenarios, it could take even longer. Always on availability groups are going to be much, much quicker because we're failing over just the group and the collection of databases. Those databases are streamed from any number of replicas, up to 8 post SQL Server 2014. And failover time is typically very, very quick, much quicker than compared to failover cluster instances. Now, there's a bunch of other things to consider here, like which would you choose? Failover cluster instances versus availability groups. Failover cluster instances is in some ways easier on the DBA, because everything that I have in my system databases goes along with me. Jobs, packages, anything in master, anything on the machine. Essentially, it's server level protection. Where availability groups have some considerations. I'm just failing over the user databases. So what about my jobs? What about my packages? What about my logins? What about other necessities that I may happen to have on the server? Maybe the application requires a particular script in a particular directory that it expects in a particular path. Those are things that you would have to take into account with an always on availability group scenario versus a failover cluster instance. Okay, there's reasons why you see mixed deployments, and essentially this is one of them. High availability could be your failover cluster instance scenario, where disaster recovery could be an asynchronous send to another machine in another geographically dispersed scenario. Maybe I want to get out of a particular region, or maybe I have everything on the East Coast, and I want to make sure that if I had a coastal based scenario that it wasn't going to cause me an issue. Now, a little bit just kind of an overview. We talked before about how a replica, all it needed to do is pass the health check, and then everything was good. The hardware no longer has to be the same. Over this private network connection, these machines, in a traditional clustering scenario, we had what's called an is alive and looks alive check. So basically, if I said, hey, node 1, or I see you, I'm pinging it. hey, node 2, node 3, I see you. Can you give me your name? Yeah, I'm node 3. That's essentially what it did. An is alive and a looks alive check. Now, with always on availability groups, our checks are a lot deeper. We use something called SQL Server diagnostics, and it's running all the time. It provides a ton of data. We'll get into that in a little bit. These nodes, as part of these replicas, with what we call a node majority set, we have four machines. Okay, from a quorum perspective, evil is even. Even is evil, because they could have a split brain scenario to where they couldn't come to a decision. These two may say something, these two may say something. We need a tiebreaker. In this case, would be a file share witness. So the latest advice is essentially always have a witness. And the Windows will use that witness, whether it be, file share witness, a disk, a cloud witness, will use it as a tiebreaker if it needs it. And this is Windows Server 2012, post 2012 R2. So 2016, 2019 and up. Okay. Now, even with always on availability groups, okay, we use some sort of virtual network name. And this is called a listener in an always on availability group deployment. The listener is a computer object that is created in Active Directory when that listener is created through any sort of deployment, whether it be T-SQL or even through the availability group wizard. This is why you need those rights to be able to add add an object in Active Directory. There are times that your administrators are not going to like this, so you may need to work with them to actually have that created. Let them have the ability to create that computer object in Active Directory so it can be leveraged as the listener. It's essentially a virtual network name. The whole concept here is that this user does not need to deal with the complexity around your availability group deployment. Again, we're masking scenarios, right? From an application perspective. If node 2 were to go down and the app fails over from node 2 to node 3, remember, it's going to be very quick for an availability group. Maybe this user just needs to refresh their web app, and oh, there it is. It's all running and fine. Maybe they don't even notice the failover at all, right? This listener or virtual network name masks what's happening back here. Called it a virtual network name with clustering. We called it a listener with always on availability groups. Essentially, it's the same concept. Now, even with always on availability groups, we have this cluster service. Okay, this changes with certain things, but we'll get into that maybe in another session. But for now, think that the cluster service runs on each of these nodes or each of these replicas. This is helping communicate quorum and is used for communication with the nodes and replicas. Okay, so that SQL Server diagnostics, the health, that is alive, look alive checks, that's really the SQL Server diagnostics with always on availability groups. It's the is alive, look alive check with cluster service. This is all done by this cluster service that's running on each of these machines. Okay. And that is essentially what the architecture of a cluster always on availability group model looks like, without taking into account Linux, not taking into account clusterless availability groups, not taking into account some of the other scenarios. This is like a traditional, what we know as a traditional deployment. Okay, so let's take a look at just some of the features, and it's really hard to go through absolutely everything on this slide. So just some things that you can do in an availability group. Multiple database failovers. Yeah, multiple secondaries. Four pre 2014, 8 after 2014. I can have 3 synchronous secondaries, 2 with an automatic failover pair. That was new to 2016 and up. Synchronous and asynchronous. This is really important. Basically, synchronous says no data loss, with potential of impacting the performance of the application. Asynchronous says, okay, there could be some data loss. How much? Well, it depends on those scenarios that we talked about before. The syn queue, right? how much data has not been sent. So that's important to understand and take account of. Compression, encryption, and auto page repair, those all came from database mirroring capabilities. We have the control of automatic versus manual failover. This is something that that you're going to need to decide. Do I want to need automatic failover? If I have automatic failover, I'm going to have to be synchronous. It has to be in sync. If I have manual failover, that's more of a DR scenario. And manual failover could be likely, from a DR perspective, asynchronous, because we're likely over a geographic range where the potentially over a poor WAN connection, for example. Now, our database health detection, I mentioned I'd talk about this a little more. So you can select in an availability group now whether or not I want to have the entire group fail over if there's an instance level issue or a group level issue, or if a particular database could cause a group to fail over, right? If you have a Windows cluster, this would be a fun interview question, right? If you had a Windows Server cluster and you had an available, let's say, let me restart. If you had a Windows Server cluster and you had a database become corrupted on that cluster, just one database, traditional failover cluster instance with SQL Server, would a failover occur? And the answer would be no. Right, this isn't something that would affect the cluster service. It would not initiate a failover. This is just, it would be just like as if you didn't have clustering set up at all. This is something that you would have to investigate, right? Well, the same is true with an availability group traditionally without this option enabled. The database health detection failover, this is a net new scenario to 2016. The way I like to look at it and compare it to is sort of like Christmas lights. I'm old enough to remember, Christmas is coming, right? Just around the corner. I'm old enough to remember that, if I had a Christmas light go out, the whole strand would go out. Nowadays, with the LED lights, you can take one out and move them around. It doesn't matter, right? So the question comes down is, do you want a database to affect the entire group? Or do you want the group to fail over only on an instance level decision? And that definitely is going to affect how you look at things. If you have a bunch of databases that work together for a particular application, yeah, you're probably going to want a database level failover to fail over between one machine to another. One of the key things, I'm not sure if I mentioned it because I was speaking kind of fast when I'm going through this, but one of the big differences between failover cluster instances and AlwaysOn availability groups is you have multiple copies of your data across the replicas. So if I have a four replica deployment, I'm going to have copies of my databases on 4 replicas. With clustering, I have a single shared storage scenario. So if I have a unhealthy database on a particular particular replica, and let's say it's a storage level issue, yeah, failing over to another machine might get me good. Then I fix the issue on that particular machine and then bring it back up and reapply it to the availability group. Okay. There's a ton of features that have been added, especially in SQL Server Management Studio. I strongly recommend getting the latest and greatest version of Management Studio. I think we're at 18 and up at this point. There's a bunch of stuff that you can do as far as looking at one of the scenarios that we just talked about, looking at the database level health detection, being able to look at your round robin deployment situation. There's a number of things that you can do with that. With Management Studio. Read-only routing, I'm going to focus on this a little bit. So this is one of my favorite capabilities that have been added to SQL Server 2016 and up. Before, if you had your read intent workloads going to a particular replica, it would, or if you had your read intent workloads going to a read-only replica, it would only go to the first replica, and it would only go to the second one if that one became unavailable. So you're only going to one machine separated from your primary. In up 2016 and up, you're going to scale out that load balancing workload across all of your replicas, your read-only replicas. This is an awesome scenario. So you're scaling out your read workloads, usually from a reporting perspective, and keeping all of those reporting heavy workloads away from your primary, which is a really strong capability. Of course, in 2017, we have support for SQL Server on Linux. We're not using Windows Cluster Service. I said some of this stuff changes, right? Does anybody know what we're going to use on a Linux deployment? The answer would be Pacemaker. Pacemaker is how high availability and disaster recovery would be applied to a Linux deployment, and that's a scenario where we have detailed steps. This is much different than the way failover clustering works. We could do a particular session just on that if y'all want. Using active secondaries, you can make them readable for a number of scenarios. We mentioned reporting, backing up from your secondaries, and to try to move that away from your primary is certainly a scenario that can be done. There's a lot more troubleshooting and monitoring that have been available, not just from the dashboard from an availability group perspective, but from the DMVs as well. And all of this can be automated via PowerShell. There's a ton that you can do with AlwaysOn Availability Groups, and it keeps enhancing, including enhancements in SQL Server 2019. So as I mentioned, we have both synchronous and asynchronous data movement. This is a scenario that you can change. There's, with some considerations that you need to take. Synchronous data movement is high data protection. It's going to be no data loss. Okay, so there could be some impact to the application because it basically has to acknowledge, it has to ensure that there isn't going to be data loss before you're going to actually see that transaction commit. So there's going to be some latency with that. As that said, this is dramatically more efficient SQL Server 2016 and up. So their goal when they were building 2016, SQL Server 2016, their goal was not to just be better than 2014. Their goal was to be as transparent to the SQL OS as they possibly could be. And they felt like they achieved that. And from the folks that were involved in this, the PMs, the engineers, that's a strong statement coming from them. So it is dramatically better. My customers have noticed it, and they've been able to scale up and out with availability groups a lot better post 2016. Asynchronous is going to be high performance with potential of some data loss. So again, we're at the holiday season. If you're a retailer, here comes Black Friday, right? So you may say, all right, so for the sake of performance, because we're going to need it, we're going to switch from synchronous to asynchronous. We're willing to take the risk. What I would recommend is double down on your recovery strategy from a backup perspective. If you may even want to consider from additional DR perspective is using Azure as a backup scenario if you are regionally bound from your high availability and disaster recovery scenario. I have a lot of customers that some of their DR sites are just like 100 miles away. So if you're in the panhandle right now and you're in that situation, you're probably not feeling so good. So Azure can be a good solution for that DR perspective. I mentioned that purely from if you're not supplementing your DR strategy from an availability perspective. But switching from synchronous to asynchronous is very, very simple. Switching from asynchronous to synchronous, the configuration is very simple, but it's got to catch up to be in that synchronous mode. So that's something to be aware of. So if you're taking in high amounts of records, high amounts of application workload, and you switch from asynchronous to synchronous, you're going to have to catch up and be synchronized in order to have that synchronous data protection level set. And that's something that also can be monitored in the dashboard. So asynchronous and synchronous, just kind of making sure that this is something well understood. Asynchronous is a disaster recovery solution, works well when the replicas are distributed over considerable distances. Think disaster recovery. Useful when performance is more important than the synchronized data protection. You could have some data loss. For synchronous commit is high availability over performance. I cannot lose data. I understand that there could be some application impact, but data protection is the deciding factor. Okay. Now, when I have set up my clustering, I have my cluster service running on each of my replicas, I will be able to enable always-on availability groups. I can also do this from a PowerShell commandlet by just saying enable -SQL always on. Remember that the WMI async in firewall rule has to be enabled for you to be able to do this via PowerShell, via a PowerShell window. And of course, you have to first install failover clustering and put the replicas in the same cluster for traditional deployment. Like we'll think about other deployments like Linux and clusterless and other scenarios like that in maybe another discussion. But from a traditional perspective, you must first install failover clustering and put the replicas in the same cluster in order to have SQL Server Cluster Manager and the enable always-on availability group option be available. Some new features that were added in 2014, we increased the number of secondaries up to 8. We added some additional diagnostic capabilities. The HADR functions of preferred replica and is primary were added, which certainly helps for any kind of maintenance jobs or backup jobs. Those are key scenarios around those. Just be aware of the is preferred replica and is primary functions for in SQL Server 2014 and up. Increased readable secondary availability. This reduced the events that cause readable secondaries to be unavailable. And then we saw, and I get a lot of questions about this, we saw the Add Azure Replica wizard that has been removed from Management Studio post 17. And the biggest reason is that if you're trying to add a replica to Azure and it's a very large database, there was a number of issues when trying to deploy this. The recommendation is to ship the database in some method, restore it with no recovery, and that is much easier than the Add Azure Replica wizard. You still can do this via T-SQL though. Different ways to create availability groups. I absolutely love the wizard. It's very simple. So just all you have to do is click new availability group, and then you go through the prompts, or you can have the just new availability group dialog box. I actually usually go through the availability group wizard and then go back into the properties. And of course, you can script the whole thing out to T-SQL or even do it all in PowerShell. There is no script to PowerShell capability, but you can script your entire deployment to T-SQL quite easily. The always-on health session may not be automatically started in some cases, especially if you do like a T-SQL or PowerShell deployment. Just check it in under extended events and sessions. This is one of those critical pieces that from a logging troubleshooting perspective, you want to make sure that this is enabled. So just check it after any deployment and just make sure it's running. And you just see a little green arrow and you'll know that you're in a good position. All right, so let's take a look at some scenarios here. Now, in my environment, I have all of this running in Azure. Okay, I have server 0, 1, 2, and 3, and I have my listener here, and this is like my virtual network name. This is what my customers are connecting to. When I created this listener, it created an object in Active Directory. If I was to go into my domain controller and say, Let me look in users and computers. I would see Titus Listener there. So I'm telling you this because if you have the rights to create the name, you should let your server network administrators know that this is important. If it, don't delete it, don't do anything, don't mess with it. And otherwise, you may need their help to actually create it because you may not have rights to create the objects in Active Directory. Server 0, 1, 2, and 3, in my case, I'm pretending that server 3 is like, let's say in Colorado, and I have everything else in Florida, Orlando, Jacksonville, and let's say Titusville. Now, in my configuration here, the machine that I'm really paying attention to, or the group I'm paying attention to, machine-wise is server 1. It's my primary. You see that it's my primary here for Tampa Test 1, 2, 3, and Titus AG. Here it's the secondary, actually. My primary, actually, this is the one. This is the group I want to pay attention to. Okay, so Titus AG is on server 0 in this case. I'm going to go into some properties and just kind of walk you through some of the scenarios that we've talked about up into this point. Here is the check for database level health detection. So if this didn't just kind of like concept kind of come on, you can have multiple groups with different configurations. So in this group, I'm saying like, look, let's just say AdventureWorks DW, Auto HA, and Contoso Airlines. If any of these databases were not available, the other databases would not be able to function. There's lookup queries happening all the time. So yes, I want to fail this over as a group, right? It makes sense. Or if it's a really critical database, maybe, or a set of critical databases, if any of these go down, I'm going to have a big user issue. I want to fail these over as a group. Notice here, server 0, 1, 2. I have 3 synchronous, and they have auto failover. This is a new capability. So I actually could lose a machine and still have automatic failover. If you are going to read when these are in the secondary mode, if you're going to read from them, you have to say that your intent is read only. It's the only way to be able to read, and this is necessary for that round robin scenario, round robin load balancing scenario that I was talking about before. Okay, we didn't talk about seeding mode yet, but essentially what this does is allows you to kind of, when you're doing a deployment, to apply the database to your secondaries, and it will seed and seed these over, and you can monitor this over time. It's a great option, especially for larger databases. It's a great capability in the product. Here's my backup preferences. Initially, this can be kind of confusing to read, but so you have some rules. I prefer the secondary only, primary, and any replica. But these priorities are applied to these scenarios. So if I prefer secondary, this is the weight that gets applied, and you can choose what's excluded. Remember, I said that, server 3 is in Colorado, and I have everything else local. Well, I don't want Colorado trying to, send its backups to a file server that's in Orlando. So I want to exclude server 3 completely. Maybe I'm using another method for my GeoDR situation. Maybe I'm sending it to another storage scenario, but I don't want it trying to back up over the WAN. That would be a potential situation. Now that function is the FN-HADR functions for backups are going to be important for this situation. If you use the maintenance wizard, you'll actually see that HADR function being applied and saying, hey, this is the machine that is the preferred backup for me, and so I'm gonna run the backup on this machine. The best practices is, let's say you have 4 or 5 replicas, you have the same jobs running on each machine at the same time. Use that function to either back up, or if it is the preferred replica, or exit cleanly. I've seen too many customers that just run and let them fail, but now they've got all this these error log stuff that they're having to deal with. I don't want that. If I'm an administrator, I want it to be clean. So the is preferred replica is a good function to make sure that that's done. Then we have our read-only routing. This is awesome that they added this to the product. I'm not sure if anyone's seen this yet or not. But, you know, hey, look, if I'm server 0 is my primary, go to 1, 2, then 3. If you're server 1, go to 2, 3, then 0. If you're server 2, 3, 0, 1. If I'm server 3, 0, 1, and 2. Okay, that's how this is basically set up to avoid my read-only, my read intent queries from hitting my primary and to have them round robin over my secondaries under pressure. I love that. So I love the fact that they put this in the GUI and they made it really simple. Okay. Any questions at this point?
At this point, is Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instance, when you want to configure these as an AG, are they configured through you, or are these configured by Microsoft as a service?
So it's a different configure. It's a different scenario altogether for Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance. You're not seeing this kind of deployment scenario where you're specifying the replicas. You don't see this kind of dashboard like for AlwaysOn Availability Groups where I'm saying like, okay, is server 0 healthy? You know, server 2, server 3 healthy? You can specify that in different ways. They have the capability of active georeplication. I was searching for words. Active georeplication, which is a different scenario. They have different capabilities, resiliency around databases that's different. We're always maintaining three copies behind the scenes, and so there's different levels of resiliency, and that's more managed by Microsoft, where you do have some control over options such as active georeplication. Probably that would be a great future session, so we can kind of do a compare and contrast, but it definitely doesn't look like this.
Yeah, make a note. We'd love to have you back for that.
Okay.
A few more questions here.
Sure.
Can you speak more about the load balancing options there?
Sure. Now, was that question asked before or after I showed that in the GUI?
Before.
Okay. Did that clear, whoever was asking that, did that clear that up? And how are we doing on time? So I may run out of time. You know what? Because I might run out of time, let me run, because I have way too much content.
It's always the case. Now, keep on going. If there are questions that are asked that we're not able to get to, we will follow up and potentially do an open Q&A session a little bit later this year.
Sure. So let's talk about the read-only routing scenario. So I say it's hard not to laugh because the long and dirty fight of applications and reporting, right? So for most scenarios, most customers I know, you don't have a strict massive separation of reporting and your application use. There's a lot of customers do. More customers are moving towards that model all the time, but a lot of customers deal with like, okay, how do I deal with reporting hitting my primary? AlwaysOn Availability Groups has a strong option to keep them separated. Okay, so if I have my primary replica here, say AG1 with a collection of databases, and these, what's the argument, right? I need up-to-date reporting. All right. It's like, well, I have this other machine where I'm using replication and it has to be real time. Fine. Okay. So how do I do that? How do I do real-time reporting? Well, we're streaming the transaction log. So Availability Groups is perfect for it. But I want to make sure that with a failover, that if this machine were to crash and roles were to be reversed, that now my reports go here and not here, right? So this read-only routing facilitates a redirection. It increases your availability of your read workloads, and to me, this should be in red, minimizes contention on the primary, but here's what it requires. You have to have a listener. You have to. Remember that virtual network name, Titus listener in my AG deployment? You have to have that. And the reporting, and this is a key thing to search on, Bing, Google, whatever. The application intent has to be sent from your application or your reporting application. Application intent is read-only. So that has to be set. Now, what changed in 2014, or at post 2014, excuse me. So in 2014, when transactions were routed by the listener, it went to the first secondary that was available and essentially parked there. So imagine you have this huge reporting solution and a bunch of reports are coming in. They're just massive reports. What I would see folks have to do is they would throw hardware at that machine or throw virtual hardware at that machine and go, okay, well, that's my report machine. And my read intent, my application intent read only, that scenario, hey, that's going to go to that box. Okay, that's fine. I threw a bunch of hardware at it, because I can't. The requests are going to be parked there. But didn't I just show an example of, like, if I have a failover, I want to make sure that the routing goes? Well, what do I do then? So now I'm undersized if I have if in the event of a failover. That's no good. What you can do in 2016 up is create these read-only routing lists. So think of it like a routing table inside a SQL Server, or what we would usually use, right? Like what's a good, like a F5 or like a NetScaler appliance. Does anybody use anything like that to route requests to the appropriate location? So you basically have this routing table where I'm going to say, go to computer 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. Only go to 5 if I can't get to these other machines. In fact, you can even group them. 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5 are separate groups. 6 if there's an issue. Each entry in the routing list can itself be a set of load balanced read-only replicas. Now, to see that kind of worked out, I spent way too much time on this slide, y'all. Way too much time. I think I had some coffee and I don't know. So imagine these machines here are just busy doing their reports. And I, the DBA, the last thing I want is to have it hit computer 1. Why? This is making money. I've got people and users logging in and they're buying stuff, and I've got call centers and whatever hitting this machine. The last thing I want is to have this crazy expensive reports hitting this box. So with this read-only routing 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, I'm basically having this situation here where I am just humming along really nice. I have no problems at all. I like the fact that this is working this way. And if I have an issue, then I can redirect to another machine. All the while, this guy is happy. No reports are hitting it, and it's humming along quite well. It could be a failover cluster instance. It could be a primary, and its failover order is 2, 3, 4 if there was an outage. Okay. Now let's take a look at this. I actually set this up before we got on the call. So you see this is all humming along really nice, right? We have our Titus AG machine. Okay. So if I open up this machine here, product profitability, this is all, reporting, SQL Server reporting services. If you haven't seen this before, this is 2016 reporting services. This is the completely redesigned model. And I go into my product profitability report. You see I'm hitting 3. Well, wait a second here. 3, isn't my primary 0? Well, yeah, I told it, I said, don't hit Don't hit zero. Don't hit zero. Go to some other machine. I don't want you hitting zero. You're a report. You're big and cumbersome. If there's any report developers on the line, no offense. All right. So if I scale this out, and I'm not, we'll see if this works. Sometimes I have to push it pretty hard because they try to have these sticky connections. If you're curious, like what is he doing? If you see here this little hiccup on the screen, what I did is I created a report. Oh, see that went to 2. 1, 2. It's working. Each report has a auto refresh. In Chrome, I am adding additional tabs to mimic overhead. So just by creating 5 of these reports are expensive enough, the load balancer kicks in and says, let me help you out. And it's scaling out those workloads across those replicas. I absolutely love this feature. It's one of my favorite features. I'm glad someone asked that. Because you're taking advantage of your hardware, you're taking advantage of the capabilities in 2016. Yeah, you can use an F5 or NetScaler or something like that. This is going to work perfect in an Azure deployment, a geo-replicated deployment, and I keep my primary healthy and happy. Now, for the sake of time, because I know I'm going to run out of time. For the sake of time, because I'm glad we got to that topic. Let's kind of like walk over. This is a good summary kind of scenario, and then I'll kind of 2 slides, and then this will be good. So if you have SQL Server 2012, this is what you get. Okay, and it's great. It's great. I can have asynchronous to a third site. I can be synchronous to another 2 machines. I can switch those. I have my backups and my reports. They can go to any of the machines, right? It's good. In 2014, we added the ability to add a replica to the cloud, where I can also do some replicas. I also can have 8 replicas in 2014. 2016, the performance got dramatically better. We completely rebuilt the transport layer, and we added the ability to have 3 synchronous replicas with auto failover. If I lose one, I still have an auto failover configuration, which is awesome. 2017, we added Linux, Red Hat, SUSE, Ubuntu deployment. Okay, are all available, not using Windows Cluster Service, but using Pacemaker. Now, 2016 North, we have a whole bunch of features. You saw the load balancing for secondary replicas. I love it. Increased replicas for auto failover. I covered that. What I didn't cover is group managed service accounts. I'm a security guy at heart as well as an availability guy. One of the things I've noticed, and I'm sure folks on the call can feel this. How many times when you do a cluster deployment, an availability group deployment, anything where we have a service account, right, and we have a password, how often are you really wanting to do password rotations on service accounts? I mean, do you not? I sweat bullets every time I think I'm going to change them, machine to machine, right? Wouldn't it be much easier and better if I could just change this at the Active Directory level? So the group managed service accounts can be done at the domain level, which makes this a lot easier. Now, I've had customers say, yeah, but couldn't you do that in 2014? Yes, it was supported. It got awesome in 2016. Distributed transactions are supported. Again, like I said, I recommend anything Windows Server 2012 R2 and up. I really think Windows Server 2016 and up is where you want to be, and this is one of the strong reasons why, is that you can have support for distributed transactions, and it's necessary for multiple databases that have a relationship. Dramatically improved performance. This doesn't get enough fanfare. It really should. Dramatically improve performance. Database level failover. Remember, the database goes offline, you'll be able to initiate failover for the availability groups. If it's hard to remember, think about Christmas lights. One goes out, they all go out, right? Or do I want to be able to survive a failover? Depends. Basic availability groups are now available for standard edition of SQL. This is why database mirroring is deprecated, because we have a basic availability group option. Essentially mirrors, no pun intended, what we have in database mirroring. Okay. Any questions as I go to my 2017 summary slide? So last two slides, other than kind of like wrap up. What's new in Windows Server or SQL Server 2017? We have a new cluster type. Windows Server failover cluster, external or none. Okay. Now external is going to be Pacemaker. None is going to be read scale availability groups. This is where we're getting into beyond the basic configuration that the Windows Server configuration that we've known for so long. That would be a completely different session. I think that it's important to separate these because it can become confusing. Linux has supported deployments, Red Hat, SUSE, Ubuntu. We guarantee commits on synchronous secondary replicas. The read scale availability group is designed purely for read scale performance. This is not a high availability disaster recovery situation. I'm trying to scale out my workloads. Again, cross database DTC transactions are available among all databases that are part of an availability group. Transaction log redo for memory optimized tables is executed in parallel. Additional monitoring and diagnostic improvements. If you happen to see Ignite, we had some new stuff coming in 2019. Up to 5 synchronous replicas, 1 primary and 4 synchronous secondaries with auto failover support. So you're even further increasing your auto failover capabilities. We have, this is without a listener, but having the enhanced capability to include automatic redirection of a connection to a primary based on their intent. This is not something I've tested out yet. I can't wait to, but it's going to be really interesting because it increases the number of applications that can leverage availability groups dramatically. High availability configurations for availability groups using Kubernetes, and resumable online indexes now support create operations to include database scoped defaults. So if you're interested in 2019, here's 2 good links: SQL Server 2019, what's new, just to kind of keep track of what, as this is rolling along, what's new in the product. And if you're interested in signing up, the AKA MS EAP sign up link is what you would want to go to. Some resources, just so you can see some. The hands-on labs are fantastic, by the way. I think there's up to 200 and 205 hands-on labs that they have. Full deployments, they're free to use. They have a timer to let you do all you want. Really cool stuff there. And just some of the topics that we talked about, some things that we can talk about in the future. And again, feel free to hit me up. DPLESS on Twitter. Hit me up, add me, I'll add you, direct message me. I can be slow at times, but I will get back to you. And if you want to email me, it's DPLESS, D+@Microsoft. And thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And I'm sorry I know I went a little over.
Don't worry, this is great. And I think we've got a bunch of questions here, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to gather those. As long as your email address is in the system, we should be able to email those out. And if not, I do want to do an open Q&A session for any and all concerns related to high availability or disaster recovery with a bunch of us on the other end to answer your questions. And I'd like to do that either in November or December. So stay tuned. I'll coordinate with everybody, and we'll get the broadcast out here really soon.
That sounds great.
Excellent. Cool. Well, hey, thanks for speaking for us. And for everybody that attended, thanks for taking your time to listen in. And we look forward to seeing you next month, and hopefully there at the summit too.
Awesome. All right. Take care, everyone. Have a fantastic week.
Excellent. You too. Thanks, everybody.